They told me not to take it personally when they said I wasn't invited to New Year's dinner. Your sister's bringing her boyfriend and you'd just make things awkward. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. But when they showed up at my garage ready to shame me again, it was him, the boyfriend, who exposed their secret and my worth in the same breath. And that day, their silence became my revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe /like button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The air in Boulder that morning was so cold it almost sang when I breathed. Late December light slanted through the garage windows, turning the steam from the heater into a soft, white haze. The radio played an old country song, something about wide roads and second chances. I was half under the hood of a 1968 Mustang, hands deep in the engine bay, when my phone started buzzing against the workbench. Mom, the screen read. I wiped my hands on a red shop rag, leaving streaks of grease like battle scars, and hit answer. Hey, Mom, I said, trying to sound casual. Elaine Walker didn't bother with small talk. Her voice was brisk, clipped the same tone she used when giving directions to the caterer before a dinner party. Grace, about New Year's Eve. Don't worry about coming this year. Emily's bringing her boyfriend to meet everyone. She wants the evening to be elegant, polished. You know how she is. I leaned back against the fender, the wrench still in my hand. Elegant, I repeated softly. She just wants everything to go smoothly, Mom continued. You understand, right? You've got your work clothes and all that grease. She's nervous about making a good impression. You wouldn't want to make her uncomfortable. For a second, all I could hear was the faint hum of the heater and the song on the radio fading into static. I stared at the smudge of oil under my fingernail. I understand, I said. My voice didn't crack. It didn't even sound angry, just empty. Good girl, she said, relieved. I knew you'd be reasonable. We'll call you after the party. The line clicked dead. I stood there holding the phone until the country singer's voice drifted out of the radio again. Something about heartbreak being easier when you expect it. The wrench slipped from my hand and clanged against the concrete floor. I stared at the dark puddle of oil under the Mustang and thought about how my mother had just told me I didn't fit in with my own family. I shut off the radio, and the silence hit like a punch. Outside wind scraped against the garage door. I could smell snow coming, that sharp metallic scent that always reminded me of winter mornings when Dad would warm up the car for Mom. And I'd sit in the back seat wondering why he never asked me to join him. For a long moment I didn't move. My hands were stiff from the cold, but it was something else that made them shake. I tried to laugh, but the sound caught in my throat. You're a mechanic, I whispered to myself, repeating Mom's words like a bad prayer. You wouldn't fit in. I walked to the sink, washed my hands, and watched the black water swirl down the drain. The soap didn't take all the oil off. It never did. But at least it gave me something to do. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, buzzing softly. I picked up my phone again and opened the family group chat, a list of messages filled with holiday photos, heart emojis, Emily's Pinterest-perfect dinner setups, Mom's so proud captions. My name wasn't in any of them. At the top of the screen, a new photo appeared, Emily holding a champagne glass perfectly lit, captioned, "Counting down to the best." New Year yet comments poured in from relatives I hadn't seen in years. Beautiful. Can't wait to meet him. What a lovely family. I hovered my thumb over the chat for a long time before I hit leave group. The confirmation popped up. Are you sure you want to leave this conversation? I was sure. The garage suddenly felt too quiet. I opened the big door and a rush of cold air swept in, biting at my skin. The sky was pale gray, the kind that promised snow, but hadn't decided when. I stepped outside, boots crunching against gravel, and watched the flakes begin to fall. Soft, careful, like they were testing the ground before committing. Across the street, Christmas lights still hung from Henry Cole's porch, blinking unevenly. I'd fixed his fuse box last week when he couldn't figure out why half the lights were dark. He paid me with a pie and a story about delivering mail in the 70s. It had felt more like family than anything I'd had in years. Now, as I stood in the driveway with my breath clouding the air, I realized how small I looked next to the open garage. My world was oil cans, metal, the hum of machines that always made sense. People never did. I thought about calling my mother back, telling her how it felt to be uninvited from her table because of what I did with my hands. But I knew it wouldn't matter. She'd just sigh, call me dramatic, tell me Emily's party was important. The snow thickened, covering the footprints I'd made. I looked down at my gloves cracked from use and imagined my family sitting in that warm Denver house, candles flickering on polished silver. Emily laughing while her boyfriend charmed them. They'd raise a toast to a perfect year. And me, I'd be here in the cold, with an engine that still needed fixing. I turned off the garage light and stood in the doorway, watching the snow settle on the hood of the Mustang. "Mom's right," I said quietly. "They'll get their perfect photo without me." The words hung in the air, heavy and honest. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. Just a stillness I couldn't name, like the silence after an engine dies and the world forgets to start again. I walked back inside, shut the garage door, and leaned against it until the hum of the heater filled the space again. The light flickered once more, reflecting off the chrome bumper in front of me. For a moment I saw my own reflection, smudged, imperfect, real. "Happy New Year, I guess," I murmured. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and relentless, covering everything it could touch. Denver, 1998. The house smelled like lemon polish and fresh bread. The kind of smell that told visitors everything they needed to know. This family had money manners and appearances to keep. I was 10 years old, lying on my stomach under the dining room table, with a flashlight between my teeth, trying to figure out why the outlet had stopped working. "Grace," my father's voice boomed from the doorway. "Charles Walker, always pressed shirts and polished shoes, even on weekends. What on earth are you doing down there?" "Fixing it," I mumbled around the flashlight. "The outlet's loose." He frowned the same way he looked at a stain on his tie. "Girls shouldn't be crawling under tables," he muttered in Vietnamese accented English that he used only when he was annoyed. Though we'd lived in Colorado our whole lives, his tone could still cut like glass. "That's not what a young lady should be doing." Before I could answer, my mother appeared behind him, smoothing Emily's hair into perfect curls. Emily at 7 stood still in her new pink dress, the skirt puffed out like a cupcake wrapper. "Look at your sister," Mom said proudly. "So graceful, so put together. Why can't you be a little more like her?" I looked up from under the table, hands covered in dust. "Because she doesn't know how to fix things," I said before I could stop myself. Mom's eyes flashed. Dad exhaled sharply through his nose. "You're missing the point," he said. "Being useful isn't the same as being presentable." I learned to stop answering after that. Silence kept the peace. Years passed, and silence became second nature. By the time I hit high school, I'd stopped asking for their approval and started hiding in the shop room. That was the one place that made sense. The smell of sawdust and solder, the sound of things being built instead of broken. I remember the day my science teacher called home to tell them I'd won first place at the regional engineering fair. That night at dinner, Dad barely looked up from his plate. "That's nice," he said. "But let's be realistic. Engineering isn't really for girls. You should think about interior design like your mother, or PR like Emily will." Mom nodded, sipping her wine. "Something cleaner," she added. "Something you can talk about at parties." Emily, sitting across from me, smiled sweetly. "It's not a big deal, Gracie. Some people are meant to shine, and some people help them shine. You're good at helping." I stared at her, trying to figure out if she meant it as comfort or cruelty. Maybe both. When I turned 18, a letter arrived, an acceptance packet from the Colorado Institute of Technology. Full scholarship. I carried it into the living room, heart pounding. Dad didn't even read it. He folded the papers neatly and handed them back. "You don't need to go," he said. "Our family business will keep you stable. And besides, a woman crawling under cars for a living. People would talk. I don't care what people talk about." I said, my throat tight. "I just want to do something that feels real." He smiled, that patronizing half smile I'd come to hate. "Reality is overrated, sweetheart. Leave the heavy work to men." That night, I packed the letter into the bottom drawer of my dresser and didn't look at it again. For years. A few weeks later, on Emily's 16th birthday, Dad surprised her with a brand new silver sedan parked in the driveway. Bose balloons, a whole crowd of neighbors watching. She squealed, ran into his arms, and Mom cried. I stood by the porch, holding the car keys, while Emily posed for photos. Later that night, she found me adjusting the mirror on her new car. "What are you doing?" she asked, frowning. "The side mirror was loose," I said. She tilted her head, that perfect hair shining under the porch light. "Thanks, but be careful, okay? Don't scratch the paint." That was the moment something inside me shut down. I realized love in our house wasn't unconditional. It was transactional. My worth came in the form of things, fixed, bills, handled, tasks completed. When Emily graduated high school 2 years later, she threw a party in the backyard. String lights, a catered buffet, everyone dressed like a magazine spread. I spent the morning fixing the fuse box after the lights tripped. When the guests arrived, Mom took my wrench from my hand and said, "Go inside, honey. You'll ruin the photos." From the window, I watched them raise glasses of champagne. My father made a toast about family and success. Emily laughed like music. I thought about the words they used most often around me. Practical, dependable, strong. They sounded flattering until you realized they were just synonyms for invisible. The older I got, the clearer it became. I wasn't the daughter who sparkled under chandeliers. I was the one crawling under tables holding the wires together so the lights stayed on. People used to tell me I was lucky to have such a perfect family. Maybe from the outside it looked that way. White fences, polished floors, holiday cards sent on time. But perfection is just another kind of silence. You learn to smile for pictures while your insides rust. When I left for Boulder at 24, I didn't tell them right away. I just packed my toolbox and drove off before sunrise. They didn't call for 3 days, and when they did, Mom's voice was more puzzled than worried. "Grace, why would you move all the way out there? Don't you get lonely?" "I'm used to it," I said. She laughed softly. "That's not funny. Neither was the truth. Sometimes I still think about that little girl under the dining table flashlight between her teeth, proud, because she made something work again." She didn't know that one day the same hands that fixed her home would be the reason she got uninvited from it. I became the daughter who could repair anything, outlets, engines, even people when they broke down. But not the kind of damage that comes from being unseen. Being useful is a strange kind of curse. It earns you gratitude, not love. And when love is measured by what you can do, you learn to live on scraps and call it enough. When I left Denver in 2010, I didn't know what I was running toward, only what I was leaving behind. The city had always been loud with expectations, sharp-edged with judgment. Boulder felt different from the first moment I arrived. The mountains pressed against the sky like quiet witnesses. The air smelled of pine and oil, and there was space, real open space, to breathe. I found the listing for Marilyn Grant's garage on a community board at a diner. Looking for an apprentice, the paper said in shaky handwriting. No quitters. That part made me smile. Marilyn was in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a bun and hands calloused from decades of engine work. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses when I showed up at her shop door. "You know your way around a carburetor?" she asked. "I can fix one blindfolded," I said. She raised a brow. "We'll see about that. That first month nearly broke me. Marilyn worked like the laws of physics didn't apply to her age. She shouted over the music, taught me every sound an engine could make when it was lying to you, and never once told me I was doing well enough. You either make it right, she'd say, or you make it again. But she also believed in something I'd never heard before, that women could build, create, and repair. Not just decorate or maintain. Machines don't care what you look like, she told me one night while wiping her hands on a rag. That's why I trust them more than people. By the time 2023 rolled around, Marilyn had retired, and the shop was mine. Walker Restoration Garage wasn't big. 2 bays, concrete floors, a wall lined with tools I'd collected over the years. But it felt like a cathedral to me. The sign outside, freshly painted, read, "Women Owned." Every morning I'd unlock the door and breathe in that familiar smell of oil and metal, the smell of work that made sense. Henry Cole. My neighbor was usually waiting with coffee. 72, retired mailman's soft voice, still wore his old postal jacket like a second skin. He claimed he came by to check the mailboxes, but really, I think he liked the company. "You know," he said one morning, sitting on a stool while I tightened a bolt, "this place sounds better than church." "Probably smells worse, though," I said, grinning. He chuckled, tapping his cane on the floor. "Ain't the smell of hard work that bothers me. It's the smell of people pretending they ever worked a day in their lives." We laughed, and I realized that in this small garage, I'd found something I never had back home. People who saw me as I was, not as I should be. That afternoon, Tanya Rivera showed up, her old blue Toyota sputtering like it was taking its last breath. She stepped out with a nervous smile, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I know she's a mess," she said, patting the hood. "I just need her to last until tax season." "Can I, pay you in parts? Parts or pie?" I asked. She blinked. "Pie." "Yeah," I said, tossing her a smile. "Homemade counts. Especially apple." Her shoulders dropped in relief. "You got yourself a deal, Miss Mechanic." Over the next week, Tanya stopped by every afternoon bringing her daughter Lily. 9 years old, all freckles and curiosity. Lily followed me around the shop like a shadow, watching every move. "Why's it called a ratchet?" she asked one day. "Because it clicks like one," I said, showing her how to tighten a bolt. "Can I try?" I hesitated, then handed her a small wrench. "Just don't tell your mom if you break something." She grinned, turned the bolt with both hands, and looked up at me with a kind of pride I remembered feeling once, before it was taught out of me. When Tanya came to pick her up, Lily held out her hands blackened with grease. "Look, Mom. I'm like Grace." Tanya gasped. "Oh, honey, your clothes." "It's fine," I said. "The world needs more girls who aren't afraid to get dirty." That night after they left, I cleaned up the shop, humming to myself. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. I thought about Marilyn, probably somewhere in Arizona, now retired with her cats, and wondered if she knew how much she'd changed my life. Machines don't lie, she'd told me once. And if they do, you just have to listen long enough to catch them. People lied in ways that took longer to hear, but here, under the hum of the heater and the rattle of tools, there was no pretense. One Saturday morning, Henry came in holding the local paper, shaking it like it was bad news. "You seen this," he said. I wiped my hands on a rag. "If it's about taxes, don't ruin my weekend." He laid it flat on the counter. The headline read, "Emily Walker engaged to Denver investor Daniel Reed." Underneath was a photo, my sister glowing in a white dress, her arm around a tall man in a suit. Behind them, Mom and Dad beamed like royalty. Henry squinted. "She related to you?" "Yeah," I said. "That's my sister." "Well, she looks like she's got it all figured out. Maybe she does." I stared at the photo. The flawless hair, the expensive smile. They looked exactly like they wanted to be seen, polished, perfect, untouchable. Henry folded the paper. "You gonna call her?" I shook my head. She knows where to find me. After he left, I sat on the stool by the workbench, staring at the photo again. Emily's happiness looked staged, like a commercial for a life she was trying to sell. I wondered if she ever thought about me, about the sister she'd left behind in the oil and the noise. I set the paper down and turned back to the Mustang I'd been restoring. My reflection curved along its chrome bumper. I ran a finger over the metal, smooth and cool, and whispered, "Congratulations, Emily." Then I flipped the switch on the radio. The music filled the space again, and I went back to work. 3 days before New Year's Eve, the garage smelled like paint thinner and pizza. The Youth Mechanics Club, 5 teenagers from the community center, were covered in more blue paint than the project they were supposed to be working on. One of them, a tall kid named Ryan, had managed to smear a streak of primer across his forehead, like war paint. "Careful," I said, laughing as he spun with the roller in his hand. "You're supposed to be painting the panel, not yourself." He grinned, unbothered. "This is what creativity looks like, Ms. Walker." "Yeah." "Well, creativity doesn't pay for new paint cans," I said, pretending to scold him. The group laughed, and for a second, the place sounded like joy. That sound used to be rare here. Before the kids, it had been all metal and silence. Now the laughter echoed off the concrete walls, mixing with the faint music playing from an old speaker. My phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. Mom. I wiped my hands, picked up the phone, and read the message. "Grace, remember not to come for New Year's. We already agreed. It'll just be easier for everyone. No love you. No hope you're well. Just logistics. Like I was some appointment they didn't want to reschedule." I stared at the text for a long time before I typed anything. The blinking cursor felt like it was mocking me. Then I simply deleted the message and tossed the phone face down. Henry, sitting in the corner reading yesterday's paper, looked up over his glasses. "You're not going back to Denver, huh?" I shook my head. "No, nobody wants me there." He folded his paper carefully, the way only men from another generation do. "They're lost, kid. You've got more family here than most people ever find in blood." I smiled, even though my chest ached a little. "Yeah, maybe that's true." When the teens left, I stayed behind, cleaning up the scattered rags and tools. Outside, the sky had already turned that deep blue that comes before snow. I looked around the garage and saw the string of old Christmas lights I'd never taken down. Maybe it was the cold or the loneliness or just stubbornness, but I decided to make my own New Year's dinner. I dragged out a few folding chairs covered in old wooden crate with a plaid tablecloth and set out mismatched plates. Then I hung the lights along the rafters, their soft yellow glow turning the shop into something warmer, almost magical. By 7, Tanya and Lily had arrived, carrying a pie still warm from the oven. The kids from the club filtered in too, bringing takeout boxes and energy drinks. Henry showed up last, bundled in his thick coat, holding a 6-pack of root beer. "This is one hell of a dinner table," he said, smiling as he sat down. "Don't get used to it," I teased. "Next week it's back to grease and busted carburetors." Tanya laughed. "Grease I can handle. Busted, not so much." We ate, we talked, we passed around the root beer like it was champagne. Lily stood up at one point holding a piece of paper she'd folded and refolded until the edges curled. I wrote something, she said shyly, a poem for Ms. Grace. Everyone quieted down. She read it in her small, careful voice. "She fixes cars and hearts with hands that never rest when things fall apart. She makes them work their best." For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat tightened. Henry clapped slowly, then everyone joined in. Tanya hugged her daughter, tears shining in her eyes. "That's beautiful, baby." I looked around at all of them. These people who didn't owe me anything but still showed up, and something inside me settled. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me. Maybe this right here was my real table. After the food and laughter faded, everyone trickled out into the cold. Tanya promised to bring coffee in the morning. Henry waved from his truck lights, flashing once as he pulled away. I stayed behind, cleaning up again out of habit. The silence that filled the space after everyone left wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. I turned on the small radio near the workbench, twisting the dial until I found a station that wasn't static. A woman's voice came through clear and bright. "Tonight on Women Who Work with Their Hands, we're talking about a local mechanic in Boulder who's been teaching underprivileged teens the art of auto repair completely free of charge. They call her the Grease Angel." I froze, the rag still in my hand. The host continued, her tone warm. "It's women like her who remind us that skill, kindness, and resilience don't need fancy titles or clean hands." I leaned against the counter, eyes burning. For a second, I thought about calling the station saying thank you, or at least asking who sent the story. But instead, I just stood there letting the words wash over me. No one said my name, but they didn't have to. I knew. Maybe I wasn't invisible after all. I turned down the volume, sat on the stool by the window, and watched the snow fall outside. It looked like the world was finally quiet enough to listen. The first morning of the new year came heavy with snow. Boulder was buried under white silence, the kind that made even the air seem cautious. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Mom. "Your father and I are coming by. We need to talk. No Happy New Year. No warning. Just that." For a moment I considered not replying, but I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of accusing me of being dramatic. I typed back, "Okay, I'll be here." 2 hours later, a dark SUV pulled into the driveway. The sound of doors slamming broke the stillness. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door before they could ring the bell. My father, Charles Walker, stood in front wearing the same tailored coat he'd probably owned since before I was born. My mother, Elaine, was next to him, her scarf wound perfectly around her neck, not a hair out of place. Emily hovered behind them, fur-lined coat. Flawless makeup, eyes already rolling before she'd even spoken. Snowflakes clung to their shoulders like decoration, not mess. They didn't come in to say hello. They entered like they owned the space, eyes sweeping the room as if checking for things that might embarrass them. Charles didn't waste a second. Why, he said, voice booming with the confidence of a man who always assumes he's right. "Did you tell the family you weren't invited to New Year's dinner? Everyone's calling us. They think we abandoned you." I stared at him. "You did," I said. He blinked, thrown off by how calmly I said it. "That's not the point." "It kind of is," I replied. Emily sighed loudly. "Oh my God, here we go again. You always have to make everything about you, don't you? Mom just asked you not to come this one time, and suddenly you're some martyr telling the world how awful we are." I felt my pulse quicken, but my voice stayed steady. "I didn't tell anyone anything, Emily. Maybe people just noticed I wasn't there." Mom stepped forward, her perfume sharp in the cold air. "Don't play innocent. You know how our family talks. This has made us look terrible. You've embarrassed us." For years they'd said words like that. Embarrassed, image, reputation, as if those were sacred things that needed protecting. But not once had they ever said dignity, honesty, kindness. I crossed my arms. "Maybe you're embarrassed because what you did was cruel." Elaine's face tightened. "Grace, watch your tone." My tone? I laughed softly. "You uninvited your own daughter from dinner because of how she looks, how she works, and you're worried about tone?" Emily folded her arms, stepping between us like she was the referee of a fight she'd started. You really need to stop twisting things. Mom didn't uninvite you. She just knew you'd be uncomfortable. You hate these kinds of events anyway. That's not true. Oh, please, Emily snapped. You'd show up in your grease-stained jacket and ruin the photos. I met her gaze. So that's what this is about. Photos, appearances, what you can post, not who's actually there. For a second, no one spoke. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Then my father stepped forward, his jaw clenched. You think you're better than us now? With your little garage and your charity work? No, I said. I just think I stopped pretending. Mom's voice went sharp. You've always been difficult, Grace. Always pushing back, always trying to prove something. You can't just let things be simple. Simple. I repeated the word, tasting bitter. You mean obedient? Before she could answer, a voice came from behind them. Excuse me, it said, quiet but clear. They all turned. A man stood near the door, brushing snow from his coat. I hadn't even noticed him before. He was tall, dark hair, the kind of expensive watch you notice, even if you're not trying to. His expression wasn't angry, just curious. Emily's tone softened instantly. Why are you? He ignored her, looking at me. You're Grace Walker, right? The question caught me off guard. Yeah, I said slowly. Why? His eyes widened, a little recognition dawning. You restored that 1967 Mustang at Walker Restoration Garage last summer, didn't you? I froze. Yes. His face lit up with genuine admiration. That was you, I saw. The before and after photos on a classic car forum. The attention to detail, the wiring, the chrome polish. It was incredible. I didn't realize you were the Grace Walker. Behind him, Emily's expression changed from confusion to panic. Charles frowned. You know her? Daniel turned toward him. Know of her, yes. Her work's talked about in restoration circles all over the state. Emily's voice cracked slightly. She just fixes cars. Daniel glanced at her, surprised by the dismissiveness in her tone. No, what she does is craftsmanship. I'd call it art. Silence hit the room again, heavier this time. For years, my family had talked about my work like it was something to be tolerated, something that existed beneath them. And now, in one sentence, a stranger had turned it into something worthy of respect. Mom forced a laugh too high-pitched. That's sweet, but I'm sure you're exaggerating. Daniel shook his head. I'm not. Her restoration was featured on 3 online forums. Professionals were debating whether it came from a high-end shop or a private collector's garage. Nobody believed it was a small business. Dad's jaw twitched. Emily's cheeks flushed bright red. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. Daniel looked back at me. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've been meaning to ask if you ever take commission work. Sometimes, I said quietly. He smiled. Then I'll be in touch. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Emily turned away, muttering something under her breath. My parents avoided my eyes. The silence between us was no longer mine to carry. It was theirs. They'd come here to accuse me of ruining their image, and instead they'd watched it shatter in front of them. I stood there, hands in my pockets, snow still clinging to the threshold, and for once, I didn't feel small. The truth had spoken for me. The silence in the room was sharp enough to cut through the hum of the heater. Daniel took one step closer, snow melting off his coat onto the hardwood floor. His tone wasn't dramatic, just steady, like he was stating a simple fact. I brought my father's car to your garage last spring, he said. A '67 Mustang Fastback. The shop owner said a woman had done the restoration. I didn't believe it, until now. I blinked. That was yours. He nodded, smiling faintly. I've never seen anyone handle details like that. The wiring, the engine tuning, the finish. Every inch of it looked like it had been rebuilt with respect, not just skill. It's rare. Emily stepped forward, her voice tight. Daniel, what are you doing? She just fixes cars. He turned toward her, calm but unflinching. No, Emily. What she does is art. She turns scrap metal into memory. For a moment, no one breathed. My father's expression hardened, color rising in his cheeks. We don't need compliments for that kind of work, he snapped. It's dirty low, not something this family discusses at the table. Mom stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the rug. She always did that. Stared at something harmless when things got uncomfortable. I looked at her, waiting for her to say something to defend me, but nothing came. Just that silence that had followed me since childhood, polished and polite. Inside, something shifted. I'd spent years craving approval from these people, chasing crumbs of praise that never came. But in that moment, it didn't feel like I needed it anymore. Daniel glanced between us, clearly realizing the family dynamic he'd just stepped into. His voice softened. I didn't mean to start an argument. I just wanted to say thank you. That restoration meant a lot to my family. My dad passed away a month after you finished it. That car was his dream. You gave him back a piece of it. My breath caught. I hadn't known. He looked straight at me, his eyes warm despite the tension around us. If I'd known who you were, I would have said this sooner. Thank you, Grace. The room tilted slightly, not because of shock, but because of how foreign, genuine gratitude felt in this house. My father shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath. Emily, red-faced, reached for Daniel's arm. We should go. This is ridiculous. Ridiculous, he asked, glancing at her. Your sister rebuilt something I thought was gone forever. I don't think that's ridiculous. She tugged at his sleeve, voice trembling. You're embarrassing me. He exhaled slowly, almost sadly. Funny, he said. That's exactly what you said about her. Emily froze. The words landed like small stones breaking glass. Mom looked up, then eyes darting between us. Let's not turn this into a scene. I almost laughed. A scene, like life was a stage and we were just actors reciting lines she'd written. But I stayed quiet. I didn't need to say anything. Every truth in that room was already hanging in the air, impossible to ignore. Daniel straightened his coat. For what it's worth, Grace, he said gently. Your work speaks for itself. I'll never forget it. He nodded once to me, politely to my parents, and let Emily drag him toward the door. She didn't say goodbye, just muttered something under her breath that got lost in the sound of the wind. The door shut behind them, leaving the three of us standing in the cold vacuum of everything they refused to acknowledge. Dad's voice broke the quiet first. You think you've proven something here? No, I said softly. I think someone else just did it for me. He scowled, his face red. You've made this family look foolish, airing dirty laundry, getting some stranger involved. Stranger, I asked. He saw me before you ever did. His jaw tightened. You always twist words. Always play the victim. I'm not playing anything I said. I'm just done pretending this is normal. Mom took a step forward, her tone pleading now. Grace, we didn't mean to hurt you. We just wanted what's best for everyone. I met her eyes. No, you wanted what looked best. There's a difference. Her lips parted, but no words came. The wind outside howled against the windows. Dad muttered something about ungrateful children and stormed out the front door, slamming hard enough to rattle the glass. Mom hesitated, then followed, coat brushing against the frame as she left. I stood there alone for a long time, the air still smelling faintly of their perfume and anger. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from release. Through the front window, I could see their car backing out, tires crunching over the snow. Emily sat rigid in the front seat, Daniel in the passenger side, his head turned toward the window. For one brief second, our eyes met. He gave me a small nod, almost an apology. Then the car disappeared into the white street. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was clean. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel lesser. I didn't feel like the daughter left out of the photo. I opened the door and stepped outside, letting the snow bite at my cheeks. The street was quiet, the world blanketed in light. I looked up at the falling flakes and whispered. Maybe for the first time they actually saw me. The words disappeared into the cold air, but I didn't need anyone to hear them. I already knew they were true. 3 days after the storm on my porch, the world outside had gone quiet again. The snow melted into gray slush, the kind that soaked through boots, and made everything look tired. Inside the garage, I tried to fall back into rhythm. Fixing, cleaning, teaching. Metal didn't care what had happened. Machines never did. Henry showed up that morning, as he always did, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand. You holding up, kid? He asked, his voice half concern, half routine. I'm fine, I said, reaching for a socket wrench. Then I smiled, weak but honest. Or at least I'm learning how to be. He nodded, setting the coffee beside me. That's all any of us can do. Work helped. The smell of grease, the hum of the heater, the steady rhythm of bolts tightening. It all kept the noise in my head quiet, but that quiet didn't last long. During lunch, I checked my phone out of habit. A new post glared back at me. Emily's latest update. The photo showed the New Year's party in full glitter silver dresses, champagne glasses, smiles so wide they looked rehearsed. The caption read, "Some people love playing the victim just to stay relevant. Here's to real happiness and real family." The comments poured in. your glowing, beautiful family. Ignore the drama girl. You deserve peace. I set the phone down, staring at the half-eaten sandwich on my workbench. Somewhere between frustration and disbelief, I laughed under my breath. Not the kind of laugh that feels good, the kind that catches in your chest like a cough. People always said social media was fake, but it still stung to watch your life rewritten in filters and captions. Those who try hardest to look perfect are always the ones most afraid of being seen. I scrolled once more, then locked the screen and shoved the phone back into my pocket. That evening, Tanya stopped by with Lily. She carried a tray of empanadas, warm and golden, the kind that smelled like comfort. "You look tired," she said, setting them down. "I'm fine." "I lied again." Lily peeked up at me. "Mom says liars get bad luck." Tanya laughed. "Ignore her. She's been reading too many fortune cookies." I smiled, grateful for the noise of them. It filled the space that used to echo. A week passed. Work picked up. People coming in to repair cars damaged by snow and salt, but something inside me still felt unsettled. Then one afternoon, a voicemail popped up on my phone. A woman's voice, calm and confident. "Hi, Grace. This is Valerie from the podcast Women Who Work with Their Hands. I heard about your garage through a local community story. We'd love to interview you about your journey, your business, your mentoring work. It could inspire a lot of women out there." I listened twice, heart-pounding. I almost deleted it. The idea of talking about my life felt exposed. But later that evening, when Henry and Tanya stopped by, I told them, "You should do it," Tanya said immediately. "People need to hear stories like yours." "I don't know," I said. "It'll sound like I'm trying to make this about my family. I don't want to feed that narrative." Henry leaned back in his chair. "Then don't talk about them. Talk about you. The girl who built something out of nothing. That's your story, not theirs." The next morning I called Valerie back and said yes. 2 days later, I was sitting in a small recording studio in downtown Boulder. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Valerie smiled from behind the mic. "Just speak from the heart," she said. "You've already done the hard part. You lived it." When the recording started, I took a breath. I've spent a long time being told I don't fit. I began, that I should tone myself down, wash my hands more often, smile more. But I wasn't born to fit into anyone else's mold. I was born to build my own. Valerie nodded, her eyes soft. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" I thought for a moment. Sometimes. But if they had, I might still be waiting for permission to exist. When it was over, she thanked me. I drove home in silence, unsure if I'd done something brave or foolish. The episode dropped 2 days later. At first, it was quiet. Then my phone started buzzing. Messages, notifications, emails. People sharing the podcast, tagging the garage, thanking me for saying things they'd never had the courage to say. "You're the reason I went back to school. My daughter wants to be a mechanic now. I think you're the woman who got uninvited from that family dinner. If so, thank you for showing the rest of us what strength looks like." I didn't confirm anything, but the comments came faster anyway. The internet connected dots faster than any family gossip chain could. By evening, the podcast had been shared thousands of times. I sat in my kitchen, the radio humming softly when the phone rang again. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. "Grace," a man's voice said, quiet and careful. It took me a second to recognize him. "Daniel." He exhaled a sound somewhere between relief and exhaustion. "Yeah. Sorry for calling so late." "It's fine," I just said. "What's going on?" There was a pause, the kind filled with too much unsaid. "Your father's being investigated for tax fraud," he said finally. "I thought you should know. Emily's losing it. Your mom's trying to control the damage." I leaned back against the counter, closing my eyes. I figured something was coming. He hesitated. I just wanted to say, "I left. I can't be part of that anymore. The lies, the show, all of it." Silence stretched between us. I didn't know what to say, only that my throat felt tight. "You don't need to change anything," he said quietly. "You're already enough. You've always been." For a long time I didn't speak. The heater clicked on in the background, filling the quiet. "Thank you," I whispered finally. When the call ended, I set the phone down and pressed my palms to my face. The tears came before I could stop them. Soft, quiet, nothing dramatic. Just release. For the first time in years, they weren't tears of shame. They were what it felt like to be seen. 2 weeks later, Denver was buzzing with scandal. Walker Designs, the The company that had built my family's image for decades was suddenly all over the news. Local luxury firm under investigation for financial misconduct, the headline read. According to reports, a whistleblower inside the company had exposed years of misreported expenses and fraudulent contracts. The story spread fast, each outlet trying to outdo the other. TV anchors spoke the name Charles Walker with the same mix of curiosity and judgment people reserved for politicians caught lying. Images of my father walking briskly through the company's glass doors played on repeat the caption below, reading, "Under fire." At home in Boulder, I watched it once, then turned the TV off. There was no satisfaction in seeing him cornered, just a strange quiet, like hearing thunder from miles away, and knowing the storm isn't yours anymore. Emily went dark on social media within a day. Her last post, "Real happiness comes from integrity," was buried under comments that aged faster than milk. Mom. I was told tried to save face by posting about our family's resilience before deleting that too. I didn't call them. I didn't have to. The noise was doing what I never could, making them listen. That Thursday morning I was in the garage teaching my students how to calibrate a torque wrench. The space smelled like coffee-cold metal and the faint sweetness of paint thinner. Ryan cracked a joke about me being the coolest boss ever, and everyone laughed. It was the closest thing I'd felt to peace in weeks. Then the black SUV rolled up. I knew that car. The same one my father used for client meetings, family dinners, and photo ops. Even before he stepped out, I felt the temperature drop. Charles Walker climbed from the driver's seat, his coat buttoned high against the wind. His eyes were red around the edges, not from crying. He was too proud for that, but from exhaustion. He walked toward me, ignoring the curious glances from the students. "Kids," I said, forcing a smile. "Take 5. When they'd gone inside, he stopped a few feet from me. "Grace," he began. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "You look busy." "I am," I said. "What do you need?" He cleared his throat. "You're still part of this family." "Am I?" He sighed, scanning the garage like it was foreign territory. "Walker Designs is in trouble. There's a technical issue with the internal records. Corrupted files, maybe. Your name's still on one of the system maintenance contracts from years ago. You know that software better than anyone. We need your help." I wiped my hands on a rag, meeting his gaze. "When it's convenient, I'm family. When it's not, I'm an embarrassment. Which one is it today?" "This isn't about that," he said sharply. "This is business." "No," I said. "This is about consequences. And I don't owe you rescue." For a second, his composure cracked. "Please," he said quietly. "They'll shut everything down if we can't recover those files." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to walk away. Another part, the part that still believed in doing what's right, not what's deserved, wouldn't let me. "I'll look," I said finally. "But not to save you. To make sure the truth comes out." He didn't answer, but relief flickered across his face like a weak light. "There's a lawyer handling the case," he said. "She'll meet you tomorrow. Her name's Catherine Lewis." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Thank you, Grace." I didn't reply. The next afternoon I met Catherine at a downtown Denver office. She was in her mid-50s, sharp, gray suit eyes that missed nothing. "I've heard a lot about you," she said, shaking my hand. "Let's get to work." We sat in a glass-walled conference room, surrounded by boxes of financial records. The company's internal system logs were a mess. Data-wiped invoices, duplicated signatures forged. I knew the software from years back before I quit helping my dad clean up numbers that never quite matched. As I scanned through the corrupted files, a pattern began to form. Someone high up, definitely not a low-level employee, had been rerouting client payments into a shadow account. The audit trail was buried but not gone. I could see it faint as a fingerprint in dust. "This isn't accidental," I said, turning the screen toward Catherine. "Whoever did this knew exactly what to hide." She adjusted her glasses. "Can you trace it?" "Give me an hour." 2 hours later, we had a name. Not my father. Not my mother. The head of operations, a man Dad had trusted for 20 years. The same one who'd written the public statement defending the company the day before. Catherine exhaled. "You just saved us 6 months of investigation." "I didn't do it for you," I said. "Or for them. I did it for the people who'll lose their jobs if this gets pinned on the wrong person." She studied me, her expression softening. "You're a good one, Grace. Don't let their mess harden you." By the time I left the office, dusk had settled over Denver. The city glowed with the same shallow beauty I'd grown up resenting. Glass towers reflecting gold light, pretending nothing bad ever happened behind them. The next morning, headlines hit the local papers again. Whistleblower vindicated Walker Designs fraud linked to senior executive. But one smaller line near the bottom caught my eye. Former estranged daughter AIDS investigation. Grace Walker identified as key technical consultant. I stared at the words for a long time. I hadn't asked for my name to be there, but seeing it attached to truth instead of shame, did something I couldn't quite name. The city that once ignored me now knew who I was. Not as an accessory, not as a disappointment, as someone who'd fixed something that mattered. That evening, as I locked up the garage, my phone buzzed with a notification. A news alert. My picture, taken from the company's old website, sat beside the headline, "The Mechanic Who Exposed the Lie." For a second, I didn't breathe. The lights inside flickered, catching the reflection of my name across the screen. Grace Walker. I turned off the phone, slid it into my pocket, and whispered into the empty shop. Guess I'm not invisible anymore. By mid-January, winter had settled deep into Boulder. The kind of cold that made the air bite and the ground sparkle. Inside the garage, warmth spilled from the string lights I'd never taken down. The walls hummed with chatter laughter, the clinking of mugs. We called it New Year Replay, our own small celebration for the people who hadn't had one. Tanya brought her famous chicken pot pie still steaming from the oven. Henry arrived with a box of donuts and a grin that could melt snow. The kids from the Youth Mechanics Club carried in paper cups of hot chocolate and a speaker blasting classic rock. Lily, wearing her oversized denim jacket, ran straight to me and handed over a handmade card covered in glitter and smudged marker. "Read it," she said, bouncing on her toes. I opened it. In shaky handwriting it said, "Thank you. Ms. Grace for fixing cars and people. You're our hero." My throat tightened. I blinked fast and ruffled her hair. "You're gonna make me cry, kiddo." Henry raised his mug. "To Grace, the only mechanic in Boulder who can make both engines and teenagers run right." Everyone laughed, and I joined them. For once, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. These weren't just customers or neighbors. They were my people. Music filled the space. The smell of pie and pizza mingled with motor oil. Lily sat on a workbench reading a poem she'd written for the club, her small voice cutting through the noise. Tanya leaned against the counter, watching her daughter with quiet pride. Henry told a story about delivering mail during a blizzard in the 70s, and the kids pretended to groan even though they loved every word. It felt like family, not the kind I was born into, but the kind that stayed when life got cold. I was wiping down a table when the door creaked open. The laughter dimmed. Elaine stood in the doorway, clutching a photo frame against her chest. Her coat was buttoned wrong, and her eyes looked tired, softer than I remembered. Snowflakes melted in her hair. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She stepped inside, hesitant. "I saw the story," she said. "On the news. About what you did for the company. For your father." I didn't answer. She looked around the garage at the lights, the mismatched chairs, the people who had stopped mid-conversation to give her space. Then she looked back at me and held out the frame. "I found this," she said, her voice trembling. "It's you and Emily. You were maybe 7 or 8. You both painted that old dresser in the backyard. I was furious because you got blue paint all over your clothes. I took the photo. 2 little girls covered in streaks of color grinning at the camera. Emily's bow was crooked. My hands were stained. We looked happy." Elaine's voice cracked. I wanted so badly for everything to look perfect. I kept trying to paint over the flaws, make the picture brighter, cleaner. I didn't realize I was erasing the parts that made it real. You were the real part, Grace. The garage was silent except for the hum of the heater. I felt something inside me shift, an ache I'd carried for so long softening just a little. I set the photo down on the table and looked at her. "I don't need perfect," I said quietly. "I just need honest." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Then she stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. It was awkward at first, her perfume mixing with the smell of engine oil, but after a moment it felt like something had broken open in both of us. When we pulled away, her voice was barely audible. "This place," she said, glancing around the garage. "It's warmer than our house ever was." That night she stayed. After everyone left, she helped me clear plates and fold up the tables. Every once in a while, I'd catch her smiling at the walls, the tools, the tiny imperfections she once would have hated. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. In the morning, she brewed coffee while I adjusted a carburetor. When she finally left, she paused at the door. "I'll call you," she said. "If that's okay." "It's okay," I said. "Drive safe." She hesitated, then pressed the photo frame into my hands before walking out into the cold. Later that day, a gray sedan pulled into the lot. A woman in her 50s stepped out with a clipboard and a bright scarf. She introduced herself as Allison Grant, the producer from the Women Who Work with Their Hands podcast. "We're doing a follow-up story," she said, smiling. "People loved your episode. We'd like to film a short segment about your garage, your students, this community you've built." I hesitated, glancing around at the cluttered workbenches and half-finished projects. "It's not fancy." "That's why it's perfect," she said. "We're not filming tragedy. We're filming hope." I agreed. By afternoon, the crew had set up cameras and soft lights that made the garage glow like something out of a movie. Tanya and Henry laughed behind the scenes while the kids tried to act natural. "Just do what you always do," Allison said. "Forget the cameras." We did. Lily held a wrench, grinning as she handed it to me. "Here, Ms. Grace. I'm your assistant." The crew laughed. The camera operator caught that moment. Her smile, my laugh, the lights reflecting off a row of half-built engines. Later, Allison showed me the playback. "This," she said, pointing to the screen, "is what people need to see." I watched Lily's laughter fill the frame, bright and unfiltered. For the first time in a long while, I didn't see loss or bitterness. I saw life, messy, loud, and real. That clip went online a few days later. People called it the moment that made them believe in goodness again, but for me it was simpler than that. It was proof that even after everything, the world still had room for light. The video aired on a Sunday evening just as the snow began to fall again over Boulder. I hadn't expected much, maybe a few views from locals, a handful of encouraging comments. But by Monday morning, the mechanic who turned a garage into a family had exploded across social media. Millions watched, shared, commented. The thumbnail showed Lily handing me a wrench, her smile wide and unfiltered light catching in her eyes. The comments came faster than I could read them. A beautiful story of resilience. "She reminds me of my mom, proof that strength doesn't always wear a suit." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I just kept refreshing the page, half expecting the numbers to stop climbing. They didn't. By midweek, reporters were calling the garage non-stop. News stations wanted interviews. Influencers I'd never heard of tagged the story with words like hope and authenticity. My voicemail was full of voices telling me they believed again, in work, in community, in kindness. But for every light that shined brighter, something else dimmed in Denver. Charles Walker, the man who once corrected reporters for spelling his title wrong, was asked to step down from Walker Designs. The board called it a necessary change in leadership. The Denver Chronicle ran a front-page headline, "Inside the Culture of Pretense in Luxury Design." The article described private meetings, fake partnerships, doctored invoices. Everything he'd built on image unraveling in daylight. Emily, meanwhile, was trending for all the wrong reasons. Screenshots leaked from her PR firm exposing that she'd bought thousands of followers and hired a team of stylists to create her authentic life online. A brand she represented cut ties publicly. The same comment section that once adored her now turned cruel. Fake shallow karma's real. Elaine deleted every account she had. She stopped posting, stopped defending, stopped pretending. She didn't show up at charity events anymore, didn't attend luncheons or host garden parties. She lived quietly now, sometimes texting me to ask how Lily was doing, or to send a recipe she'd rediscovered in an old book. Her messages always ended with the same words, "I'm proud of you." I never said it out loud, but I forgave her somewhere along the way. Karma doesn't come with thunder. It comes like light through a cracked window, soft, patient, inevitable. The truth doesn't scream. It just keeps shining until the lies burn themselves out. One afternoon, about a month after the video went viral, I heard the familiar rumble of an engine outside the garage. A car door shut, followed by the crunch of boots on snow. When I looked up, Daniel Reed was standing in the doorway, holding a framed photo. "Hey," he said, smiling. "I didn't call first. Hope that's okay." "It's fine," I said, setting down a wrench. "What brings you to my side of the mountains?" He stepped inside, brushing off the cold. "I wanted to give you this." The photo showed the red Mustang I'd restored. the one he'd mentioned during that first awkward encounter with my family. The car gleamed under sunlight, perfectly balanced between history and renewal. "It still runs perfectly," he said, "like you." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "You sure you're not just trying to flatter your mechanic?" "Maybe a little," he admitted, then quieter. "But mostly I wanted to say thank you, not just for the car, for everything. You stood up when no one else did. You didn't destroy them, you just told the truth and kept walking. That takes a kind of grace most people don't have." The pun wasn't lost on me. I smiled. "You give me too much credit. I just fixed what was broken." "Yeah," he said, "but you also knew what not to touch. That's harder." We stood there for a moment, the silence between us easy, not heavy like before. He glanced around the garage at the rows of polished tools, the walls covered in photos of the kids I'd mentored, the small sign over the door that read, "Walker Restoration, Women Owned." "You've built something good here," he said. "Something real." "Real's all I've ever wanted," I said. He nodded, sliding his hands into his coat pockets. "I should get going. I just thought you deserved to hear it in person." As he walked toward the door, I called after him, "Daniel." He turned. "Thanks for seeing me," I said. He smiled, that same soft smile he'd had the day he first said my name, like it meant something. "I think that's what everyone's doing now, seeing you." When the door closed, the cold slipped in for a second before the heater caught up. I looked at the photo again, the red Mustang shining like new. Outside, snow began to fall in slow, lazy drifts. I stood at the window, watching it coat the driveway, feeling the quiet settle deep in my chest. For the first time in a long time, my heart felt weightless. Not because I'd won anything, but because I'd stopped losing myself. I wiped my hands on a rag, set the photo on the counter, and went back to work. By the time spring rolled into Boulder the following year, everything felt lighter. The snow melted early that season, leaving the ground soft and damp, and the garage windows open for the first time in months. The sign above the door no longer read just Walker Restoration Garage. Below it, a new plaque gleamed in brushed steel, Walker Technical Foundation, empowering women in skilled trades. It had taken almost a year to get here. The paperwork, the licensing the city permits, it all felt endless at first. But now, standing in the middle of the expanded space, I could finally breathe. Where there used to be one lift, there were now 3. The smell of paint mixed with the faint scent of wildflowers from the open door. Henry still showed up every morning at 8 sharp, even though I told him he didn't have to. He'd hand me a cup of coffee and a handful of peppermint candies. "You know," he said one morning, leaning against a toolbox, "if I had a boss like you 40 years ago, I might have stuck around longer at the post office." "You just like the free donuts," I said, smiling. He grinned. "Can't deny that." Elaine had started coming by too. She didn't announce it, didn't ask permission. She just began showing up with folders under her arm and a quiet determination to be useful. She helped organize applications for the new classes, sorted through sponsorship paperwork, and even learned how to use the label maker. She didn't talk about the past much, but every so often I'd catch her watching me while I worked her expressions soft and unguarded. One afternoon, I saw her standing by the wall of framed photos. At the center was a black and white picture of Marilyn Grant, the woman who taught me everything I knew about classic car restoration. Her silver hair glowed against the dark background, her smile confident and kind. I'd hung her photo higher than my own. "She'd be proud," Mom said quietly behind me. I nodded. She already was. That's what kept me going. We didn't say much else, but it was enough. By April, the foundation was officially registered. Donations from local businesses came pouring in after the viral video. We'd set up scholarship programs for girls who couldn't afford tuition, created apprenticeships with partner garages, and even arranged part-time jobs for single mothers learning new trades. Every time I walked through those doors, I saw pieces of my old life rewritten. Rust turned to purpose, silence turned to laughter. Not everyone returned, though. Emily didn't show up to the opening, not even a message. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to California, trying to start over in a smaller PR firm. Sometimes when I cleaned my desk, I'd come across the old family photo. The 4 of us lined up in our perfect clothes, smiling like we believed it. I'd look at it for a moment, then slide it back into the drawer. Some memories were better left folded away. On the morning of the foundation's opening ceremony, the sky was impossibly blue. Balloons hung across the entrance, the tables lined with donated cupcakes, and a banner painted by the youth club kids fluttered in the wind. Building futures one wrench at a time. Elaine was at the registration desk checking names. Henry handled the coffee station. Tanya had baked 3 pies. Even Lily had dressed up, if you could call her overalls and pink sneakers dressed up. As guests filled the garage, I stood near the stage we'd built from repurposed pallets. My heart thudded hard enough to feel through my jacket. Then I saw him. Daniel. He walked in quietly, hands in his pockets, wearing jeans and a navy jacket that looked lived in. There was no entourage this time, no expensive watch or practiced posture. Just him. "Hey," I said, meeting him halfway. "Didn't expect to see you here." He smiled, small and genuine. "Wouldn't have missed it. I heard you built an empire. More like a very organized chaos," I said. He looked around, eyes taking in the lights, the students laughing near the workstations, my mother at the desk. "It's beautiful," he said simply. "You did this." I shrugged. "With a lot of help." He studied me for a second, then said, "You know, I used to think happiness looked like perfection, clean lines, polished smiles, everything under control. But standing here, I think it's this. Just being real." I smiled. "And just because your hands are clean doesn't mean your heart is." He laughed softly. "That's fair. When he left, I didn't feel sadness. Just warmth, quiet, and steady. Some people come into your life to teach you how to see yourself more clearly. He was one of them." As the ceremony began, I took a seat near the front while the kids prepared their presentation. Lily stepped up to the microphone, her hair tied back with a grease-stained bandana. She held a crumpled sheet of paper and smiled nervously at the crowd. "My name is Lily," she said, her voice echoing through the garage. "And I want to tell you something Ms. Grace taught me." She looked right at me. She said no one is too small to be strong. And I believe her, because now I can fix things. And not just cars. The applause started soft and grew until it filled every corner of the space. Tanya wiped her eyes. Henry clapped loud enough to drown out the music. I looked around. The lights, the people, the laughter, and felt something I hadn't known in years' stillness. Not the kind that comes from emptiness, but from peace. These people weren't here because they had to be. They were here because they chose to be. And that, I realized, was what family really meant. As the ceremony ended, I stood beside Marilyn's photo, my hand resting against the frame. "We did it," I whispered. "And it's beautiful." Outside, the sky glowed with the first light of spring. For once, everything felt whole. The sunlight that afternoon felt softer than usual, spilling through the wide windows of the garage and catching the edges of chrome and paint. Dust floated in slow motion through the air. I was tightening the last bolt on an old blue Chevy pickup, a restoration I'd been working on for weeks. The radio hummed faintly in the background, some country song about forgiveness and time. For once, both words made sense to me. The door creaked behind me, and Henry's familiar shuffle followed. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a peppermint tucked into the corner of his mouth. "You look peaceful, kid," he said. "Haven't seen that in a while." I wiped my hands on a rag and smiled. "Guess it took me 32 years to figure out how to breathe." He laughed quietly. "You've earned it. You feel okay now?" I tightened the wrench once more until the metal clicked just right. "Yeah," I said. "I'm okay. I don't need an apology anymore. I forgave them a long time ago. I just hadn't said it out loud." Henry nodded, that knowing kind of nod only people who've seen a lot of life can give. "That's the trick, isn't it? Forgive them before they understand what they lost. That's how you win." Before I could answer, the door opened again. The smell of cinnamon drifted in first. Mom, Elaine, walked in holding a small white box in both hands. Her hair was streaked with more gray now, but she looked calm, lighter somehow. "I brought muffins," she said. "Henry told me you never take lunch breaks." "I'm being slandered," Henry said, grinning as he pulled out a chair. I laughed. "You can't bribe your way into my schedule, Mom." "I can try," she said. We sat together at the old wooden workbench that had served as a dining table desk and counseling corner for years. The air smelled like sugar and grease, my favorite combination. We talked about small things, the weather, Lily's latest science fair project, the Foundation's next round of students. It felt normal, simple. At one point, Elaine looked around the garage, her eyes landing on the banner that read Walker Technical Foundation. Her voice softened. "You know," she said, "I used to think success was something you displayed. Now I think it's something you live in." Henry chuckled. "Took you long enough to figure that out." She swatted him playfully, then smiled at me. "You built something real here, Grace. You made something beautiful out of all that noise. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her and smiled back. There was no resentment left, no hidden wound waiting to reopen. Just peace. The quiet kind that doesn't need permission. When they left later that afternoon, the garage fell silent again, except for the ticking of the cooling engine. I leaned against the Chevy, looking out the window. The last patches of snow were melting along the driveway, revealing the dark, wet pavement underneath. The world was thawing. So was I. I stepped outside, breathing in the clean air that still carried the faint smell of winter. The wind brushed against my cheeks. My hands were rough nails still lined with traces of oil, but they no longer felt like a mark of shame. They were proof of work, of survival, of becoming. Inside, the light caught the metal letters of the foundation's sign, and for a moment the garage looked like it was glowing. I walked back in, grabbed the wrench one last time, and fastened the final bolt on the Chevy. The sound was crisp, satisfying, a full circle closing. I whispered under my breath, "This work never made me small. They just chose not to see it." The garage hummed with quiet life. On the far wall, Marilyn Grant's portrait watched over it all, her smile kind approving. I touched the edge of her frame. "You were right," I murmured. "The world catches up eventually." As the sun dipped lower, the walls turned gold. I switched off the radio, letting silence settle over the room. It wasn't empty anymore. It was whole. For years I thought justice meant making them admit what they'd done. But real justice, I realized, was this, when their words no longer had power, when their absence stopped hurting, when I could finally stand still without feeling invisible. That was freedom. That was the reward. I washed my hands, though the smell of oil never really left. I didn't want it to. It was part of who I was. The light faded, leaving the garage glowing in the soft warmth of dusk. I took one last look around, the workbenches, the photos, the laughter still lingering in the air, and whispered to no one in particular, "I'm home." If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small for simply being yourself, remember, this dignity doesn't wait for an invitation. You don't need permission to be seen. You've always been enough, exactly as you are.